The desert stretched endlessly under the Nevada sun, its horizon shimmering with a cruel heat that seemed to mock the fragility of life. A column of smoke twisted upward into the pale sky, the dying breath of a helicopter that had exploded minutes earlier. Fragments of metal lay scattered across the sand, glinting like broken mirrors under the merciless light. Among the wreckage, a man dragged himself forward, his movements uneven, his breaths shallow. His name was Ethan Carter, though in that moment he could not remember it. His mind was fractured, clouded by the violent crash and the weight of betrayal. The desert offered no mercy. Stumbling across the hot sand, he finally collapsed by a dry riverbed. His suit was torn and blackened. His hands bloodied, his face streaked with ash. In his palm, a silver chain with a small letter E glimmered faintly. It was the only thing he could cling to, the only fragment of identity that survived. His eyelids grew heavy, and for a while Ethan disappeared into unconsciousness. Miles away in the quiet town of Harmony Springs, Sophie Miller hurried along. The cracked sidewalk outside St. Mary's Shelter, she carried a small basket of food in one arm and pushed her brown hair away from her tired face with the other. She was only 23, yet the weight of responsibility had aged her eyes. Her mother's constant demands, the looming debt on their family store, and the endless pressure to marry Richard Coleman had left her spirit bruised. Still, Sophie remained gentle, her kindness like a light that refused to dim. That evening, when she finished her shift, Sophie took the long road home, passing through the outskirts where the forgotten and the broken gathered. It was there by an abandoned gas station that she saw him. At first, she thought it was only another shadow bent against the fading sun. But as she drew closer, she realized it was a man, his clothes torn, his body trembling, his eyes unfocused, as if the world itself was a blur. She stopped, her heart aching at the sight. The people of Harmony Springs often turned away from those who had nothing yet. Sophie felt compelled to approach. His gaze lifted slowly toward her. Despite the dirt and exhaustion on his face, his eyes were startlingly clear, a deep blue that caught her breath. "Sir, are you all right?" she asked softly, kneeling beside him. He tried to answer, but his voice broke into a rasp, a single word escaping. "Ethan, maybe." Sophie frowned, unsure if it was his name or only a fragment of thought. She noticed the chain in his hand and the engraved letter worn but shining. She placed a hand on his arm, feeling how cold he was, despite the desert heat. "You poor thing," she whispered. "Wherever you came from, it does not matter right now. You need help, and I will not leave you here alone." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the desert in blood-red light, Sophie made her decision. She lifted his arm across her shoulders and began the long walk back toward town, unaware that the broken stranger leaning against her was not only a man with no memory, but the missing heir to a billion-dollar empire. Sophie Miller lived in a modest two-story house on the edge of Harmony Springs, a place where the paint peeled from the porch railings and the wind rattled the loose shutters at night. Life had never been easy, but after her father passed away, the burden fell heavily on her shoulders. Her mother, Margaret Miller, was a woman hardened by years of disappointment, clinging to the desperate belief that marrying her daughter into wealth was the only salvation left. Sophie's elder brother Daniel was restless and bitter, often blaming Sophie for being too soft-hearted, and never seizing opportunities that could rescue their crumbling family store. Their debts had piled up like bricks on Sophie's chest, threatening to crush them completely. Richard Coleman entered their lives like a storm disguised as sunshine. Handsome in a cold, sculpted way, with slicked back hair and a polished smile, Richard belonged to one of the most powerful families in the region. The Colemans owned hotels, banks, and land that stretched further than most could imagine. Richard's interest in Sophie was not born of love, but of possession. To him, Sophie was beautiful in her innocence, the kind of woman who could make him look gentler, to the world a trophy to parade. Margaret saw in him a lifeline, ignoring the rumors of his cruelty toward women and his ruthless business tactics. To her, a Coleman marriage meant security status and relief from the relentless creditors. One evening, as Sophie helped her mother prepare supper, Margaret brought up the subject yet again, her voice sharp with insistence. "Sophie, you are not a child anymore. Richard has been patient, but his family expects an answer. Do you want to see us thrown into the streets when the bank takes everything?" Sophie set down the knife she had been using to slice vegetables and met her mother's eyes. "I do not love him, Mom. I cannot tie my life to a man I do not trust. He frightens me." Margaret slammed her hand against the counter, her frustration boiling over. "Love does not pay bills. Love will not save this house. Richard can, and he will if you marry him. Your sister married well, and she has everything. Why must you be so stubborn?" Sophie's chest tightened. She thought of her younger days, when her father had promised her she could choose her own path, that happiness mattered more than gold. But those promises had died with him. Daniel entered, overhearing the argument, and shook his head in disgust. "You think you are special, Sophie. You think life gives second chances to dreamers. A marriage to Richard could save us. Instead, you walk home, carrying scraps for beggars and orphans. You will doom us all." Sophie bit her lip, her heart pounding, but she did not respond. The secret of the strangers she had carried home still weighed heavily on her. Ethan lay in the small guest room upstairs, his wounds bandaged, his breaths shallow but steady. She had not told her family yet. That night after dinner, Sophie crept into the guest room with a bowl of soup. Ethan stirred his eyes, opening slowly. He looked around as though searching for meaning in every shadow. "You are safe now," Sophie whispered. "This is my home. Rest here until you are strong enough." He blinked, uncertain, clutching the chain in his hand. "Why?" he asked faintly. Sophie smiled softly. "Because everyone deserves kindness." Meanwhile, Richard had already learned of Sophie's hesitation. He visited the Miller home the next afternoon, his black car shining like a predator crouched at the curb. He entered without waiting for invitation, his presence filling the room with arrogance. Margaret greeted him eagerly, almost bowing in her desperation. Richard's gaze, however, sought Sophie. "Your mother tells me you are still undecided," he said smoothly. Sophie straightened her shoulders. "It is not indecision, Richard. It is refusal. I cannot marry you." Richard's jaw tightened, though his smile remained. "You misunderstand. This is not about what you want. This is about what is necessary. Your family's debts are no secret. Without me, they will lose everything. Think of your mother. Think of Daniel." Sophie's hands trembled, but she held her ground. "I would rather marry a beggar on the street than a man who treats people as tools." Richard chuckled darkly, his eyes narrowing. "Careful what you wish for." Beggars have nothing to offer but hunger and shame. Upstairs, Ethan stirred, hearing voices below, the tone sharp and dangerous. He could not piece together the details, but a sense of dread filled him. Margaret quickly intervened, her tone pleading. "Richard, she is young and foolish. Give her time. I will talk sense into her." Richard leaned closer to Sophie, his voice a whisper meant only for her. "1 month, that is all. If by then you are not mine, I will see your family destroyed. Your store will be gone, your home taken, your name ruined. Remember that when you look at your poor mother's face." He left with a cold smile, his car roaring away. Margaret turned on Sophie immediately, her anger like fire. "Do you hear him? He has given us mercy, and you spit on it. If we lose everything, it will be your fault. I cannot sleep at night because of you." Sophie's throat ached, but she did not respond. She climbed the stairs, her eyes stinging with tears. When she entered Ethan's room, she found him awake, watching her with quiet intensity. She forced a smile. "Do not mind the noise. Families fight. It is nothing." But Ethan's gaze softened with something she could not name. Though he did not understand, though his memory was a haze, he felt the pull of her sorrow and the strength of her resolve. In that moment, Ethan Carter, the man who had once commanded boardrooms and conquered markets, felt the stirrings of gratitude toward the girl who had nothing yet gave everything. Sophie did not know it yet, but her choice to save him would ignite a storm that would change all their lives forever. Sophie woke early the next morning, the pale light of dawn slipping through the thin curtains of her bedroom. She moved quietly so as not to wake her mother and brother, carrying a basin of warm water and a clean towel upstairs. The stranger she had named Ethan still lay asleep, his breathing shallow but steady. She sat beside him, carefully dabbing at the dirt on his forehead and cleaning the wounds along his arms. He stirred faintly, opening his eyes with a look of confusion, as though he were caught between two worlds. "It is all right," Sophie whispered. "You are safe here. Rest." He did not answer, but she saw relief flicker in his eyes before they closed again. Over the next few days, Sophie tended to him with a devotion that surprised even herself. She cut his matted hair short, washed his ragged clothes, and replaced them with an old set of Daniel's shirts and trousers. Ethan seemed uncomfortable in the unfamiliar garments, but accepted them with a quiet nod. He spoke rarely, sometimes murmuring fragments of words, other times staring blankly at the ceiling as though trying to catch a memory that refused to return. Each time he clutched at the small silver chain in his hand. Sophie wondered what story it held. To her, he was both fragile and mysterious a man, stripped of identity, but carrying an aura of something larger than his present state. Daniel, however, did not share her compassion. One evening, when Sophie brought Ethan a tray of food, Daniel confronted her outside the room. His voice dripped with resentment. "Why is he still here, Sophie? He is nothing but a burden. We can barely feed ourselves, and you waste food on some stray." "What if he is dangerous?" Sophie held her ground. "He is hurt, and he has nowhere else to go. I could not leave him to die on the street." Daniel scoffed. "You think kindness will save you. It will not save the store, and it will not stop Richard Coleman from taking what he wants. You are a fool." Sophie pushed past him and entered Ethan's room, her heart heavy but resolute. She placed the tray beside Ethan and tried to smile. "Do not listen to what others say. Eat while it is warm." Ethan looked at her with eyes that still seemed distant yet searching. Slowly he picked up the spoon as though each movement required thought. Sophie sat by his side, watching him eat, feeling a strange comfort in his presence. It was not logic but instinct that told her there was something different about this man, something hidden behind the veil of his lost memory. Days turned into a week, and slowly Ethan regained some strength. Though his memory remained fractured, his body responded to rest and care. Sophie often found herself talking to him as she worked, telling him about the shelter, the store, and even about her father, who had once taught her to never turn away someone in need. Ethan rarely answered, but his eyes followed her closely, as though her voice was an anchor holding him steady. One afternoon, Sophie took him outside for fresh air. They sat on the porch as the sun dipped low, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. She handed him a cup of tea and asked softly, "Do you remember anything about your life before I found you?" Ethan frowned, shaking his head slowly. Only flashes, faces, a sound of engines, a fall. His hand tightened around the chain. It must mean something. Sophie leaned closer, studying the engraved E. "Maybe it is your name," she said gently. "Until you remember more, I will call you Ethan." His gaze lifted to hers, and for the first time, he managed a faint smile. "Ethan," he repeated softly, as though trying the name on for size. That night, Sophie felt a warmth in her chest, a fragile hope, that maybe he would heal, and that perhaps she had found someone who needed her as much as she needed him. But Margaret's patience had worn thin. She confronted Sophie in the kitchen, her face pale with worry and anger. "This is madness. Keeping that man here will only bring trouble. Richard will not tolerate it, and neither will I. You will send him away tomorrow." Sophie stood straighter than she ever had before. "No, mother. He has no one. I cannot abandon him." Margaret's voice cracked with desperation. "You think your kindness will save us when the bank takes our house." Sophie's eyes filled with tears, but she did not waver. "I will not measure compassion against money. If Richard cannot handle my choice, then let him walk away." Margaret stared at her daughter, seeing for the first time the strength she had underestimated. She turned away without another word. Later that evening, Ethan found Sophie sitting alone on the porch steps, her face streaked with tears. He sat beside her in silence before whispering, "You fight for me." Why Sophie wiped her cheeks and looked at him, her voice soft but firm. "Because someone has to, and because I believe you are worth it, even if you do not know who you are." Ethan lowered his gaze, a swell of emotion rising in his chest. He did not understand why her words pierced him so deeply, but something about her presence made him feel whole, even in his brokenness. From that night on, an unspoken bond grew between them. Sophie continued to protect him, and Ethan, though still lost in memory, began to feel the stirrings of loyalty and something deeper, something dangerously close to love. The small town of Harmony Springs whispered about the girl who had taken in a beggar, but Sophie ignored them all. She only knew that letting him go would feel like losing something she could not replace. What neither she nor Ethan realized was that the world outside their fragile sanctuary was already moving against them. Richard Coleman had heard whispers of the mysterious man living under Sophie's roof, and his pride could not allow it. For him, Sophie was already his possession, and whoever dared to stand in his way would pay the price. Margaret Miller could no longer contain her fear and anger. Each day she watched her daughter grow closer to the man they barely knew, a man with no past and no future, and it filled her with dread. Late one night, she stormed into Sophie's room, her eyes blazing. "This ends now," she hissed. "Do you realize what you are doing to us? Letting that beggar stay here under our roof, while Richard Coleman demands your hand. Do you want us ruined?" Sophie looked up from the book she had been pretending to read, her voice calm though her heart raced. "Mother Ethan is not a danger to us. He is a human being who needed help. If I had left him on the street, he would have died. I could not do that." Margaret's hands clenched into fists. "He is not your responsibility. Richard came by again today. He knows about Ethan. He said if you do not accept his proposal within weeks, he will destroy us. He will make sure Daniel never works again, and that we are evicted from this house. You are gambling with all our lives for a man who cannot even remember his own name." Sophie's eyes flashed with defiance. "Then let him destroy us. I will not marry a man I do not love." Margaret slapped the table beside her bed, her voice trembling. "You foolish girl, love does not matter when you are hungry. Love does not matter when you sleep on the streets. Richard offers security. That is more than this nameless man ever can." The shouting drew Daniel from his room. He barged in, already scowling. "What are you two fighting about now?" Margaret turned on him, her frustration spilling over. "Your sister would rather throw away our future for that vagrant upstairs. She is blind to what is at stake." Daniel's gaze hardened as he looked at Sophie. "So it is true. You brought him here. You are feeding him clothing? Him while we scrape together pennies. Do you know what people are saying about you, Sophie? They laugh at us. They say the Millers have sunk so low, their daughter takes beggars to bed." Sophie's face burned with humiliation and anger. "That is a lie. I took him in because he needed help, nothing more." Daniel stepped closer, his voice rising. "Do not pretend innocence. He is nothing but trouble. I will throw him out myself." Sophie sprang to her feet, blocking his way. "You will not touch him. If you lay a hand on him, I will never forgive you." For a moment, the room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging heavy. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, torn between fear of Richard's power and the growing realization that her daughter's heart would not be bent. "Sophie," she whispered, her voice breaking, "I only want you safe. I cannot lose everything. Please just do what is right." Sophie shook her head, her voice trembling but resolute. "What you ask is not right. Marrying Richard would destroy me in ways you cannot see. Ethan may have nothing, but he treats me with more respect than Richard ever has. That is what matters." Daniel cursed under his breath and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the walls rattled. Margaret lingered for a moment longer, her shoulders slumped before following him. Alone again, Sophie sank to the bed, her body shaking. She felt torn between loyalty to her family and the conviction that what she was doing was right. Upstairs, Ethan shifted in his sleep, as though sensing the turmoil below. The fragile peace that had sheltered them was cracking, and Sophie knew the storm was only beginning. The town would not stop talking, her family would not stop fighting, and Richard would not stop pressing his claim. But deep inside, she also knew one thing: beyond doubt, she would not abandon Ethan, no matter the cost. The night was heavy with silence after the storm of voices had faded. Sophie slipped quietly into Ethan's room, carrying a candle to light the darkness. He was awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, his hands folded in his lap, as though he had been waiting for her. His hair, though freshly cut, still fell unevenly across his forehead, and his eyes looked weary yet steady. Sophie closed the door softly and set the candle down, the flickering flame painting gentle shadows across his face. For a moment, neither spoke, the silence between them more intimate than words. Finally, Ethan broke it, his voice low and rough. "They do not want me here." Sophie's throat tightened. She sat beside him close enough that she could feel the heat of his body, fragile though it seemed. "It is not about you. They are afraid of losing the house, the store, the little security we have left. They believe marrying Richard is the only way to survive." Ethan turned his gaze toward her, his eyes full of questions. "And do you believe that?" Sophie shook her head firmly. "No, I believe life is worth more than money, and I believe kindness matters more than power. I could not marry Richard. I could not live like that." Ethan's lips pressed together as though he were fighting to say something. At last he whispered, "I have nothing to give you. No past, no future, only this." He held up his roughened hands, empty but trembling. "What kind of man am I asking you to stand against your family for me?" Sophie reached out and took his hands in hers, holding them tightly. "You do not need to give me the world. I never asked for riches or power. All I want is honesty, respect, and someone who will not treat me as if I am a possession. You already give me more than Richard ever could." His breath caught at her words. He lowered his head, his voice breaking. "If I had even a piece of bread, I would share it with you. If I had nothing but water, I would give it all to you first. That is all I can promise." Sophie smiled through the sting of tears. "And if that is what you have, then I will take it gladly. Because if you have nothing, then I will share what little I have with you. Together we will not go hungry." Their eyes met, and in that fragile moment, something unspoken bloomed between them. It was not the grand declarations of love sung in songs or written in books. It was quiet, steady, born from shared struggle and simple truth. Sophie leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "As long as you stay, I will not be afraid." Ethan's heart pounded, as if those words had unlocked something deep inside him. He nodded slowly, his voice quiet but certain. "Then I will stay." Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, the world threatening to intrude on their sanctuary. But inside the small room, lit only by candlelight, Sophie and Ethan sat hand in hand, their promises binding them together. They were fragile vows spoken in the darkness, yet they carried the weight of eternity. For Sophie, it was the first time she felt seen, not as a pawn or a burden, but as herself. For Ethan, it was the first time since the crash that he felt more than broken pieces. In each other's presence, they found the faint outline of a future worth fighting for, no matter the cost. The fragile peace Sophie and Ethan had built could not last long. Within days, Richard Coleman returned his dark sedan, stopping in front of the Miller house like a predator circling its prey. He stepped out dressed in an immaculate suit, the sharp cut of the fabric contrasting with the venom in his eyes. Margaret welcomed him nervously, wringing her hands as he entered the living room. Sophie remained seated, her chin raised though her heart pounded. Richard's gaze found her instantly. "The time for games is over," he said smoothly. "My family has been patient, but that patience has limits. You have 1 month, Sophie. After that, you will be my wife, whether you wish it or not." Margaret gasped softly. Daniel clenched his fists, but Sophie spoke firmly. "You cannot force me, Richard. I do not belong to you." Richard leaned closer, his smile cold. I can and I will. Your debts hang over this family like a noose. With one call, I can make sure your store is seized. Your house sold your brother, left without work. Your mother will beg me on her knees. Do you want that on your conscience? Margaret turned to Sophie, her voice breaking. Please, Sophie, listen to him. Think of us. We cannot survive without his help. Sophie's stomach twisted, her resolve tested, but she shook her head. I will not marry you, Richard. I would rather leave this house than sell myself to you. Richard's expression hardened, though he forced a laugh. Then leave with your beggar, if that is what you want. But remember this. When the bank comes for your home, when your family is in the streets, do not expect mercy from me. He turned sharply and left the slam of the door echoing like a gunshot. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by Margaret's sobs. She rounded on Sophie with fury and despair. You have doomed us. Do you understand what you have done? If he destroys us, it is your fault. Sophie felt tears burn in her eyes, but she held her ground. If survival means belonging to Richard, then it is not worth it. I cannot marry a man who sees me as property. That night, Sophie packed a small bag. She found Ethan sitting quietly by the window in his room watching the moonlight fall across the floor. We cannot stay, she whispered. If we do, Richard will use my family against us. I have to leave, and if you will come with me, we will face whatever comes together. Ethan studied her face, searching for doubt, and found none. Slowly he nodded. Where you go, I go. They slipped out before dawn, walking through the quiet streets of Harmony Springs. Sophie led Ethan to a small boarding house on the far side of town, a place where the rent was low and the landlady asked no questions as long as bills were paid. The room was small and smelled faintly of dust, but to Sophie it felt like freedom. For the first time, she breathed without the weight of Richard's shadow pressing on her. Days passed, and though money was scarce, Sophie worked double shifts at the shelter and took sewing jobs in the evenings to keep food on their table. Ethan insisted on helping, though he had no clear skills. He chopped wood, carried heavy loads, and repaired broken fences for neighbors in exchange for a few dollars. Each evening they returned to their little room, exhausted but content in each other's company. Still whispers of Richard's anger reached them. Daniel visited once, warning Sophie that Richard's threats were real. He is planning something, Daniel muttered, his face pale. You should have just married him. Now he will ruin us all. Sophie shook her head. I would rather face ruin with Ethan than wealth with Richard. Ethan, listening silently, clenched his fists. Though his memory was fractured, instinct told him Richard's threats were not empty. He resolved quietly to protect Sophie no matter what it cost. Weeks turned into days as the deadline drew closer. One evening, Sophie returned home to find Ethan sitting at the table, a troubled expression in his eyes. He spoke slowly, as if the words were fragile. I do not know who I was before, but I know one thing now. If it comes to choosing between your safety and mine, I will give everything for you. Sophie's eyes filled with tears. She placed her hands on his and whispered, We will face it together. I am not afraid as long as you are with me. The night before Richard's deadline expired, strange men appeared in the neighborhood, watching the boarding house from across the street. Sophie saw them from the window and shivered. Ethan noticed and pulled her close. Do not worry, he murmured. They will not take you. Not while I breathe. but his confidence was shadowed by unease. Deep inside, he knew Richard was preparing a final move. At dawn the following day, a letter arrived sealed with the Coleman family crest. Margaret's handwriting trembled on the outside. Inside the message was clear: Richard demands you return at once. If you do not, he will bankrupt us completely. Tomorrow he expects your answer. Sophie crumpled the letter in her hands, her heart aching. She looked at Ethan, who stood silently, his jaw tight. "We cannot let him win," she said firmly. "I will not go back to him." Ethan nodded, but his eyes darkened. "Then we must be ready. He will not stop until he has you, or until he is destroyed." That night they held each other close, both afraid, yet unwilling to surrender. The world outside seemed determined to crush them, but inside their little room they clung to the only truth that mattered. Their love was worth any cost. Neither of them knew that within days Ethan's past would return, in ways neither could imagine, unraveling the mystery of who he truly was, and setting the stage for a battle far greater than Richard's threats. The following week began like any other, with Sophie leaving early to work at the shelter and Ethan taking odd jobs wherever he could find them. Yet strange things started happening. Small details that Sophie noticed but could not explain. One morning, Ethan repaired a broken clock for the landlady. She had expected him to toss it out, but he opened the casing with precise movements, replaced a tiny spring, and reset the mechanism perfectly. His hands moved with a confidence that spoke of experience, not guesswork. When Sophie asked him how he knew what to do, he frowned, staring at the clock as though it held secrets. "I do not know," he murmured. "It was as if my hands remembered, even when my mind did not." A few days later at the market, Sophie saw Ethan pause by a newspaper stand. His eyes locked onto a headline about the financial world, and for a moment his expression sharpened, almost predatory. He muttered words under his breath, terms she barely understood. Leveraged buyout, hostile takeover, equity restructuring. Sophie touched his arm gently, and he blinked, his gaze softening back to confusion. "It felt familiar," he said. "Numbers, deals, power. But I do not know why." The most startling moment came when two men entered the boarding house lobby one afternoon. They were dressed in dark suits, speaking quietly in clipped tones. Sophie thought nothing of them until Ethan came down the stairs and froze. His eyes widened in recognition, though he could not name them. The men glanced his way briefly, then left without a word, but Sophie saw the color drain from Ethan's face. "Who were they?" she asked. Ethan shook his head, clutching the chain around his neck. "I do not know, but they knew me." That night, Sophie lay awake beside him on the narrow bed, her mind racing. She had accepted him as a man without a past, but now fragments of another life were bleeding through. He was no ordinary beggar. The way he carried himself, the glimpses of knowledge, the way strangers reacted to him, it all hinted at something far beyond Harmony Springs. The next day, Sophie returned home to find Ethan studying a piece of paper at the table. It was a napkin from the cafe down the street, covered in neat columns of numbers and calculations. "I could not stop myself," he said when she asked. The numbers came so easily, as if I had written them 1,000 times before. "I think I used to live in a world of numbers." Sophie's heart ached with both pride and fear. "Maybe your memory is coming back," she said softly. Ethan nodded slowly, but there was tension in his eyes. "If it comes back, will you still want me? If I am not the man you thought I was?" Sophie took his hand firmly. "You are the man I chose to help. Whoever you were before does not matter to me. What matters is who you are now." His eyes softened, but he said nothing, only held her hand, as though it were the only thing keeping him anchored. Yet even as their bond deepened, shadows lengthened around them. Richard's spies continued to linger nearby, their stares full of suspicion. Margaret sent another letter, this one desperate. "Richard has offered 50,000 to save us, but only if you return. Please, Sophie, do not be selfish. Think of us." Sophie burned the letter in the small stove, watching the flames curl around the paper. "We will find our own way," she whispered. That evening, Ethan returned from work later than usual. Sophie noticed the torn sleeve of his shirt and the faint bruise on his jaw. Alarmed, she pressed him for answers. At first he resisted, but finally he admitted. "Those men in suits followed me. They cornered me in an alley and asked questions about the Fisher Group. I do not know why, but when they said that name, something in me snapped. I fought them off without thinking. My body moved on its own, like I had been trained." Sophie stared at him, her heart pounding. "The Fisher Group. That is one of the biggest corporations in the country. What could they want with you?" Ethan shook his head, frustrated. "I do not know. But when they said it, I felt something, like a door opening in my mind. I saw flashes, a boardroom, a city skyline, a pen signing contracts worth billions. And then it was gone." Sophie cupped his face gently. "It will come back when you are ready. Until then, we survive together. That is enough." Ethan exhaled, leaning his forehead against hers. Together he repeated, but even as he spoke, the words Sophie could not shake. The sense that their lives were balanced on the edge of a secret so immense it could destroy everything. And somewhere out there, men in suits whispered his name, while Richard Coleman plotted his revenge, unaware that the beggar he despised might be far more powerful than any of them imagined. Richard Coleman was not a man who tolerated obstacles. Sophie's defiance burned his pride, but what truly unsettled him were the whispers he had begun to hear about the stranger staying at her side. At first he dismissed the rumors, imagining the man to be just another drifter clinging to Sophie's misplaced kindness. But when his spies returned with reports of unusual behavior, discussions of finance flashes of authority, and fights in which the beggar fought like a man trained, Richard's curiosity sharpened into suspicion. One evening in his office, Richard poured himself a glass of whiskey and spread photographs across his desk. Blurry images of Ethan walking through town. Sophie beside him, his posture confident despite the ragged clothes. Across from Richard sat a private investigator. He had hired a man with sharp eyes and a voice low with calculation. "This is no ordinary beggar," the investigator said. "He matches the description of Ethan Carter, heir to Carter Enterprises missing after a helicopter crash 3 months ago." Richard froze his glass halfway to his lips. "Ethan Carter? The Carter family controls more wealth than mine." The investigator nodded. "If it is him and he is alive, then he is worth billions. The Carters have been searching quietly but without success. It seems he disappeared without trace, until now." Richard's grip tightened around the glass until it cracked in his hand. A slow smile spread across his face, cruel and calculating. So the beggar Sophie clings to is not a beggar at all. He is a billionaire with amnesia. The investigator leaned forward. "If you expose him, he will take Sophie away from you forever. But if you control the truth, you control him and her. Richard considered this his mind spinning. To marry Sophie while she believed herself saving a beggar would be one thing, but to chain her to him while her heart belonged to a billionaire, that would be the ultimate triumph. He would not only possess her, but humiliate her, proving that love could not defeat power. Over the next few days, Richard set his plan in motion. He invited Sophie and her family to a lavish dinner at the Coleman estate, under the guise of reconciliation. Margaret was quick to pressure Sophie into attending, pleading that perhaps Richard was willing to forgive. Sophie reluctantly agreed, sensing danger, but unwilling to worsen her mother's despair. Ethan insisted on accompanying her. "If he is planning something, I cannot let you face it alone," he said firmly. Sophie nodded, though worry darkened her eyes. When they arrived at the Coleman mansion, Sophie felt immediately uneasy. The grand hall was lit with chandeliers, the tables set with gold cutlery, yet the atmosphere was suffocating. Richard greeted them warmly, his smile polished, but his eyes gleaming with malice. Margaret gushed over the opulence, but Sophie kept close to Ethan, whose posture stiffened, as though the place tugged at hidden memories. After dinner, Richard raised his glass, tapping it lightly for attention. "I have prepared a surprise," he announced, his voice echoing. At his signal, two men in suits wheeled in a large screen. Images flickered across it. News reports of the helicopter crash, photographs of Ethan Carter, articles about Carter Enterprises. Gasps filled the room as the final image appeared. A close-up photograph of Ethan in Harmony Springs, his face clear and undeniable. Sophie's breath caught in her throat, her hand flying to her mouth. Ethan stared at the screen, his eyes wide with shock, as fragments of memory surged violently. Flames falling, metal voices shouting his name. Richard smirked, savoring their reactions. "You see," he said smoothly, "the beggar you so kindly rescued is no beggar at all. He is Ethan Carter, heir to one of the greatest fortunes in America. A billionaire pretending to be nothing." Margaret collapsed into a chair, her face pale. "A billionaire," she whispered. "Oh, Sophie, what have you done?" Sophie ignored her mother's gasp, turning to Ethan, her eyes filled with both awe and fear. "Is it true?" Ethan's chest heaved as if he could not breathe. His voice cracked. "I do not know, but it feels... yes, it feels true." Richard stepped forward, his smile triumphant. "And now, dear Sophie, you see the absurdity of your so-called love. You thought you were saving a beggar, but he never needed you. He is worth more than you could imagine. Do you think he will stay with you now, when the entire world is his again?" Sophie's heart wrenched, but she gripped Ethan's hand tightly, refusing to let go. "I do not care who he is. To me, he is Ethan. That is enough." Richard's eyes narrowed at her defiance. "Touching. But it will not save you, because tomorrow the world will know. The press will descend, the Carters will reclaim their lost son, and you will be forgotten. Unless," he paused, savoring the silence, "unless you agree to marry me. Do that, and I will bury this truth. Your beggar will remain forgotten, and you will have security forever." Sophie's stomach twisted with revulsion. "You disgust me," she spat. "You would use his past as a weapon." Richard's smile vanished, replaced by cold fury. He slammed his hand on the table. "You will regret this, you and your precious Ethan both." Guards moved closer, but Ethan stepped forward, his eyes blazing with a strength Sophie had never seen. For a moment, the billionaire inside him shone through his voice, commanding and filled with authority. Touch her and you will regret it more than you can imagine. Richard faltered, unsettled by the sudden power in Ethan's tone, but he quickly regained his composure. You cannot even remember who you are. You are nothing but a broken man clinging to scraps. Enjoy your little fantasy while it lasts. Soon you will remember everything, and when you do, you will realize she is not your world. Money is, power is, and I will still have her. He gestured sharply, and the guards stepped back. The dinner ended in chaos. Sophie dragging Ethan out into the night, her heart pounding with terror. As they fled, Ethan gripped the chain around his neck and whispered brokenly, "Ethan Carter." "That is who I am." Sophie held his arm tightly. "And you are mine no matter what your name is." Behind them, Richard stood at the mansion window, watching their retreating figures with a face of stone. His plan had only begun. He would tighten the trap, and when it snapped shut, neither Sophie nor Ethan would escape. The days after the disastrous dinner at the Coleman mansion felt like a storm pressing down on Sophie and Ethan. Sophie barely slept, lying awake in the small boarding house room, listening to Ethan's restless breathing. He had grown quieter, his eyes darker, as though the images Richard had shown had cracked something open inside him. One night, Sophie found him standing at the window, long past midnight, the silver chain clenched tightly in his hand. His voice was a hoarse whisper when he spoke. "I remember flames, I remember falling, and I remember a voice calling my name, Ethan Carter. They said I died, but I did not. I survived. Sophie." "I am that man." She went to him, her hands sliding over his trembling shoulders. "You are still you," she said firmly. "Whatever name they give you, whatever money is tied to it, none of that changes who you are to me." His gaze softened at her words, but the storm inside him did not ease. Over the next week, Fragments returned in waves, each memory more vivid than the last. He recalled his father's stern lessons at the head of a vast empire boardrooms, full of men twice his age awaiting his command, the smell of jet fuel from endless business trips. He remembered betrayal too, the strained smile of his half-brother Jamie, the sudden explosion on the helicopter, the sensation of being cast into nothingness. The past came crashing back, like shards of glass cutting into the fragile peace he had built with Sophie. One afternoon he walked into the market, unshaven and disheveled, and overheard merchants talking about Carter Enterprises. Their words, casual as they were, sparked something final in his mind. He staggered against a stall, clutching his head, as names, numbers, entire histories roared back into place. The man who had wandered as a beggar was gone, replaced by the heir who had once commanded billions. He returned to Sophie, pale but resolute. "It is all back," he told her. "Every deal, every rival, every betrayal. I am Ethan Carter, CEO of Carter Enterprises, presumed dead for 3 months, and Richard Coleman tried to trap me while I was broken." Sophie's heart raced at his words. Part of her feared what this meant. Would the world he belonged to take him away from her? Would he see her as unworthy, now that he remembered everything? He seemed to sense her fear, because he cupped her face and whispered, "Do not think I will leave you. You are the reason I survived. You are the anchor that kept me alive when I had nothing. I may be a billionaire, but without you, I am still lost." Relief flooded her eyes, though her worry did not vanish completely. "What will you do now?" she asked. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Take back what is mine, expose Richard, and make sure no one can threaten you again." That night, Ethan met secretly with Simon Harper, his loyal assistant, who had been searching for him since the crash. Simon wept openly when he saw him alive. "Sir, the company is in chaos. Jamie is preparing to declare you dead legally so he can inherit everything. The board is restless, the shareholders divided. We need you back." Ethan's eyes hardened. "Then it is time. Prepare the documents, gather the board. In 48 hours I will return." Sophie watched him transform before her eyes. The hesitant man clinging to survival became a leader again, his voice steady, his presence commanding. Yet when he turned to her in the quiet of their room, his armor slipped, and she saw the same man she had rescued vulnerable and in need of love. He drew her close, whispering, "Whatever comes, promise me you will stay by my side." She kissed him softly, "Always." The next day, Ethan made his first public appearance. News spread like wildfire. Ethan Carter thought dead was alive. Cameras flashed as he strode into the Carter Enterprises building in New York. Sophie by his side, her plain dress and steady gaze, a stark contrast to the glittering world around them. Gasps echoed through the lobby, employees bowing their heads, some weeping with joy. Jamie's face went pale when he saw his brother, but he quickly masked it with a smile. "Brother," he said loudly, feigning warmth, "we thought you gone forever. This is a miracle." Ethan's eyes pierced him. No miracle, Jamie, only betrayal survived. The boardroom that followed was chaos. Ethan laid out proof of his survival, medical records, eyewitness accounts. He presented recordings Simon had preserved, emails, and documents, tying Jamie to the attempted takeover. The board shifted uneasily, loyalty tilting back to its rightful heir. By the end of the meeting, Ethan was reinstated as CEO, Jamie cornered by evidence he could not deny. Sophie sat silently in the corner, overwhelmed by the scale of the world Ethan had stepped back into. She saw him as others did now, not as the beggar she had saved, but as a titan of industry, powerful and relentless. Yet when the meeting ended, and Ethan crossed to her, taking her hand, before everyone she knew he was still hers. That evening, Ethan and Sophie returned to their hotel suite, exhaustion heavy in their bodies. Sophie looked at him, her voice soft. "You belong to this world of wealth and power. Are you sure you still want me in it?" Ethan drew her into his arms, his voice raw with conviction. "Sophie, when I had nothing, you gave me everything. Without you, I would have died nameless in the desert. You are my world, not the money, not the power, only you." She held him tightly, tears in her eyes. But even in their embrace, shadows loomed. Richard Coleman had not given up. News of Ethan's return spread quickly, and Richard's fury deepened into obsession. He would not let Sophie slip away, nor would he allow Ethan to humiliate him. He began to weave a new trap, one that would strike at their hearts rather than their fortune. For now, though, Sophie and Ethan stood together on the balcony overlooking the city lights. The wind tangled her hair, and Ethan's arm tightened around her. "This is only the beginning," he said. "They tried to bury me, but I will rise higher than ever. And you will rise with me." Sophie rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Whatever storm awaited them, she would face it by his side. Because love, she knew now, was not about what a man owned or what he had lost. It was about the vow, whispered in the dark, the hand held when all else fell away. The promise that endured when the world itself tried to tear them apart. Richard Coleman refused to accept defeat. The revelation of Ethan's true identity had humiliated him publicly, and worse, Sophie had chosen the man he despised over the future he had promised her family. Rage twisted inside him like a knife, and he vowed that if he could not have Sophie, he would destroy both her and Ethan. He began by spreading lies to the press, whispering that Sophie was nothing but a gold digger who had manipulated a vulnerable billionaire while he was broken. Headlines soon followed, questioning her motives, splashing her face across tabloids as a schemer. Sophie endured the whispers bravely, but Ethan saw the toll it took on her. He confronted Richard directly in the halls of a charity gala, their first face-to-face since Ethan's return to power. Richard smirked as photographers circled his words, dripping venom. "The world will never accept her, Ethan. She is beneath you, and sooner or later, you will see it." Ethan's jaw tightened, his hand finding Sophie's. "You underestimate me, Richard. The world does not choose for me. I choose for myself." Richard's smile faltered, but he forced a laugh. "We will see how long your little charity project lasts." Days later, Richard's plan escalated. He lured Sophie under false pretenses, sending a message that her mother had fallen ill and needed her at a remote estate. Sophie went only to find herself cornered by Richard and his men. He blocked her path, his eyes burning with obsession. "You should have been mine," he hissed. "I offered you everything, but you threw it away for a beggar. Even now you cannot see what a mistake you have made. He will never love you as I would." Sophie's voice was steady despite her fear. "You do not know love. You know control, and I will never belong to you." Richard's face twisted with fury. He seized her arm, but before he could drag her away, the doors burst open. Ethan strode in, with Simon and a team of security, his presence filling the room with raw authority. "Let her go," Ethan commanded, his voice like steel. Richard sneered. "Or what you think your money scares me." Ethan stepped closer, his eyes blazing. "It is not my money that should frighten you, it is me." For a tense moment, the room was electric. Richard's grip on Sophie tightened as if he could will her to stay. But Sophie wrenched free and ran to Ethan's side. Richard lunged forward in a final act of desperation, but Ethan met him head-on. The two men clashed, one fueled by greed, the other by love and justice. Richard fought with reckless fury, but Ethan's blows landed with precision and power, each one honed by the memory of betrayal and survival. At last, Ethan pinned him against the wall, his voice low and dangerous. "This ends now. You tried to take my life, my company, and the woman I love, but you failed, and you will always fail." Police sirens wailed outside Simon's call, bringing them just in time. Officers stormed in, dragging Richard away in handcuffs. He spat curses, his pride shattered, but his empire of threats crumbled in an instant. Sophie clung to Ethan, tears streaming down her face, relief flooding through her. "I thought I had lost you again," she whispered. Ethan kissed her hair, holding her as though nothing in the world could tear them apart. "You will never lose me. Not now, not ever." In the days that followed, Richard's influence collapsed completely. His schemes exposed, his name ruined. Ethan restored stability to Carter Enterprises, but he made it clear that his heart belonged elsewhere. At a quiet ceremony beneath the golden glow of evening light, Ethan and Sophie exchanged vows. There were no cameras, no flashing lights, only friends, a few trusted allies, and the undeniable truth of their bond. As Ethan slid a ring onto Sophie's finger, his eyes held only her. "You saved me when I was nothing," he said softly. "And even now, with everything restored, I am still nothing without you." Sophie smiled through her tears, her voice steady. "I never cared about what you had or what you lost. I cared about you. That is all I will ever need." When they kissed, the world outside melted away. For Sophie and Ethan, love had triumphed over greed, over betrayal, over the very weight of power and wealth. In each other they had found the one truth that endured that love when pure was richer than any fortune and stronger than any empire. The weeks that followed felt like a dawn breaking after a long night. With Richard imprisoned and Jamie stripped of influence, Ethan focused on rebuilding not only Carter Enterprises, but also the life he wanted with Sophie. For the first time, he attended board meetings with her seated proudly beside him, no longer hiding her presence. Many whispered some skeptical, but Ethan silenced them with simple truth. "This woman stood by me when I had nothing. Without her, I would not be here. She is not just my wife. She is my reason." Sophie adjusted slowly to the world of wealth and power, a world she had never dreamed of entering. Yet she never let it change her. She still volunteered at the shelter, still greeted neighbors with warmth, still held Ethan's hand like she had in the dim boarding house, when all they had was a candle and a promise. Their love became a story whispered throughout the city, a reminder that fortune could vanish but loyalty endured. Ethan's grandmother, once skeptical, came to Sophie one evening and placed her hand gently on hers. "I misjudged you," she admitted. "I thought you were after his name, his money. But I see now you gave him something I never could piece. For that, I thank you." Sophie's heart swelled with quiet gratitude. She had never wanted approval, only to be accepted for who she was, and now she felt it at last. On their wedding anniversary, Ethan surprised her with a return to Harmony Springs. He led her down the quiet streets where they had first walked together, stopping at the small boarding house that had sheltered them. Though time had weathered the wood, Sophie felt tears as memories flooded back. "This is where it began," she whispered. Ethan nodded, drawing her close. "Here I was, a beggar with no name, and you saw me as worthy of love. That gift is more precious than any empire." They stood in silence, the past and present folding into each other. Sophie realized then that true love was not born in palaces or forged in riches. It was born in small rooms, lit by fragile candles, in whispered promises, in the courage to choose each other against all odds. Years later, their story was still told, not as a tale of a billionaire and his bride, but as a story of a kind girl who saved a man when he was broken, and a man who, even when he regained the world, chose to belong only to her. And in that truth, their love lived forever.